with the R2P doctrine, as it's called, not least because some of the critical players in its inception are here. One is, of course, one of the co-editors called Ramesh, Thakur, who very early on played a very significant role in guiding it, and also because our Chancellor, Gareth Evans, was very, very much involved, has been the public face to a large degree of the principle. And he, of course, has written already a major book on the norm. So, and Phil Maley has also, from very early on, been reading, analysing this concept. So I think it's something to which the ANU has a very special affiliation. Well, the idea of R2P, as many of you will know, first really emerged, or I became aware of it, I guess, in 2001, in the report of the International Commission on Intervention in State Sovereignty, which was co-chaired by Gareth Evans, but an initiative sponsored by the Canadian government. And I think this principle responded to the frustration that many people felt with UN's failure to intervene in cases such as Rwanda and Kosovo. And the idea was, and I recall this very much in international law circles, that there was no clear legal framework that allowed good Samaritans to intervene in clear cases of massive human rights abuse. So international lawyers had long discussed another doctrine, the doctrine of humanitarian intervention, as one of the exceptions on the international prohibition on the use of force in international law. But this doctrine, the doctrine of humanitarian intervention, had always been really, really controversial, both because it breached the cardinal principle of state sovereignty, and also because it could be very easily abused. So it wasn't hard to imagine a powerful state claiming the mantle of humanitarian intervention, as it happened famously in the UN intervention in Grenada in 1984. So, from an international law perspective at least, the idea of responsibility to protect solved many of the problems that were associated with humanitarian intervention. So, it didn't offer states a right to intervene, but it cast the principle as a responsibility to protect human life. So it really made clear who were going to be the beneficiaries of the norm. Secondly, the concept of R2P as it was originally formulated set a very high threshold that might discourage abuse. So the International Commission spoke of the application of R2P in cases, and I'm quoting from them, of serious and irreparable harm occurring to human beings involved in large-scale loss of life. So it seemed only to be relevant in particular cases. And thirdly, the report of the ICISS set out normative conditions for the use of R2P. So they had to be a just cause, right intention, it had to be used only as a measure of last resort, there had to be a proportionality of means and reasonable prospects of success. And so the idea was having all these factors discourage politicised use of the concept. Fourth, I think the principle was very, very attractive because it limited the style of possible interventions by emphasising the duties to prevent, react and rebuild. It also took the sting out of fears of arbitrary action by building in international institutions. So the Security Council was built in the first place, and I should say that the International Commission's formulation did contemplate coalitions of the willing as a last resort. Well, the idea of R2P when it was formulated first, I think, really caught the attention of the international community, not only because it was this attractive and appealing restyling of the norm of intervention, but also there were tremendously effective norm entrepreneurs, people like Ramesh writing about it, and people like Gareth Evans, who were very, very energetic in promoting it. And again, as is well known, it was then included in Kofi Annan's important report in Larger Freedom, which was published in March 2005. And then it was included, the norm was included in General Assembly resolutions that surrounded the UN's 60th anniversary exactly 10 years ago. And it's since been referred to in various Security Council resolutions. I was struck at the time to see that it even received papal imprimatur. I don't know what religious doctrine that is, but Pope Benedict at the time endorsed R2P as an aspect of natural reason. So it seemed initially to attract support from a lot of quite disparate fellows. So I remember in 2005, there were people like John Bolton, the famously cantankerous US ambassador to the UN, who endorsed it, as well as the non-aligned movement. But as the scholar, the NYU scholar Jose Alvarez warned at the time, he said that instinct should warn us that there must be something wrong with an idea that can be endorsed by such strange benefits. So this idea that it attracted a lot of support from different groups. And there have been, it's clear, and I think people like Nicholas Wheeler, the IR scholar, have noticed that as the doctrine of R2P achieved more institutional acceptance going up through the UN, some of the perhaps more interesting and radical aspects of it tended to be reduced. For example, some of the features that first appeared for example, in the original formulation, the limitation of the P5 veto, for example, inevitably got lost as the norm achieved more institutional acceptance. But anyway, since its endorsement by Kofi Annan 10 years ago, there's been a decade of debate and reflection on the norm. There's been a huge amount written on the doctrine, a number of really significant books, and the norm even, interestingly, has its own journal. There's a whole journal devoted to global responsibility to protect. So the question might be asked when we look at yet another book on the topic, what does this volume add to the already extensive literature? And so I approach this somewhat in a sceptical vein, thinking what can we get from this that isn't already in the books that are there. But I can assure you that after having studied it, it's really, I think it's a great treasury, a great resource, and published at a very important time on the 10th anniversary of the Annan endorsement. It's a really wonderful sampler of the debates that the principle has provoked, and a very, very sophisticated study of its impact. So I think this book offers first a series of quite thoughtful analyses of R2P's theoretical framework. How far does it extend? Can it apply, for example, to cases of natural disaster? And one of the chapters I like very much, co-authored by Ramesh, Thakur and Charlesworth, which has an extremely daunting title. It's the most daunting title in the whole book. The subtitle is FOIA Bargaining Inversions of Rights and Responsibilities in State-Citizens Relations, which I found quite demanding. But I think actually it's absolutely worth reading because it's a very intellectual and sophisticated account of the genesis of the norm and its intellectual history. So first of all, we've got, I think, a very sophisticated take on the norm. Secondly, I think the book offers a fantastic array of perspectives. And it's certainly, there's not one line in it. It's a really very Catholic approach to it. Some of the chapters in the book are very sanguine about the development of R2P and quite optimistic about its future. And Gareth Evans, for example, has a very interesting chapter in the book, which is really very sanguine about the possibilities despite some of the setbacks of the norm. But the book equally has, for those very sanguine contributions, it's also got some extremely critical chapters, and I put in that category Jonathan Grobert's critique of the military dimension of R2P, and a very tough critique of the doctrine by Siddharth Malavapu from Delhi, where he really extends the idea of R2P as a Western colonial idea. Most of the other chapters are somewhere in between these perhaps two extremes. They are impressed by the normative ambition of the R2P concept, but concerned about its inconsistency in its take-up or its inability to provide a clear response to international crises, such as in Ukraine. We have, for example, somebody who until recently was in this building, Susan Harris-Rimmer, has a very sparkling feminist reading of the responsibility to protect doctrine. She notes the embrace of the concept by senior women in the UN system, but the disappointment, perhaps even skepticism about it by civil society groups. And Cindy O'Hagan, who's here, has got a lovely chapter, I think, a very thoughtful account of the institutional culture that produced R2P. And she, I would have to do justice to her, Cindy, rejects simplistic accounts of R2P as just an period slip between the West. She offers a much more nuanced reading. And Maley also has a lovely study of R2P in the context of refugee protection and considers how the R2P norm can be exploited by states seeking to avoid responsibilities under existing refugee norms. I think Bill's analysis is very applicable to a whole range of potentially conflicting sets of norms. So, it's a delight to have read this book. It offers, I think, a fresh assessment of R2P informed by a decade of practice. It certainly doesn't resolve any of the controversies that adopt this principle since its birth, but it illuminates all of them and places them in a wonderfully rich historical context. So I once heard that the great civic historian Brett Denning, who was at the University of Melbourne for many years, said one shouldn't launch a book, but one should simply open it. So let me declare the book open and ready for reading.
In 2005, next year marks 15 years since we published our report. And I've given the title Reconceiving Humanitarian Intervention as the Responsibility to Protect. Because the key innovation in 2001 was indeed the reconceptualization of humanitarian intervention as R2P. Everything else in this discourse flows from that distinction. If that distinction fails, then the constitutive predicate of R2P is false. And the entire edifice of policy structures in the UN system and national capitals, as well as scholarly discourse since 2001-2005, collapses. My talk seeks to explain and justify this claim, in light of the fact that the attachment of many to humanitarian intervention remains unshakably strong. When I called out my friend, my Canadian friend, Roland Paris, for example, on using the term, he replied that the term, quote, continues to be widely employed in the academic literature and should be regarded as analytically neutral, unquote. In explaining that distinction, I'm going to also be interweaving the distinctions between the academic world and the policy world. We formulated R2P in 2001 as the central organizing principle for national and international action to protect people from mass atrocities. In 2004, the high-level panel on threats, challenges and change argued, quote, the maintenance of world peace and security depends importantly on there being a common global understanding and acceptance of when the application of force is both legal and legitimate, unquote. With that in mind, the panel reaffirmed the importance of changing the terminology from the deeply divisive humanitarian intervention to the responsibility to protect if the international community is going to forge a new consensus. And explicitly argued that, and explicitly endorsed and the ISIS argument that, quote, the issue is not the right to intervene of any state, but the responsibility to protect of every state. As Hilary pointed out, R2P was endorsed unanimously by the 2005 UN World Summit. Earlier, presenting his annual report on the work of the UN to the General Assembly on 20th September 1999, Kofi Annan said, while the Rwanda genocide defined the consequences of inaction in the face of mass murder, Kosovo raised uncomfortable questions about the consequences of action taken without international unity. The two together had, quote, cast in stark relief the dilemma of what has been called humanitarian intervention, unquote. Now, Kofi, for all his boldness and initiatives, is a cautious man in his choice of language. This does not seem like incendiary language. But this statement unleashed a chorus of harsh criticism from many developing countries. On 23rd September, just a few days later, the same week, the final communique of the 113-member online movement emphatically rejected any so-called right of humanitarian intervention, which has no legal basis in the Human Charter or in the general principles of international law. This sentiment was repeated in the Declaration of the South, adopted by 133 countries at the G77 summit in April 2000. If you read the English language press, you could be forgiven for thinking that the international community is the Western world. This is 133 countries and 113 countries. The majority of the world's countries rejected this vote in very strong and bitter terms and language. And yet, Annan's call also resonated powerfully among many Western governments and people. Recognizing that the international community was split on the subject, the Canadian government assembled an international commission with the mandate to reconcile the two competing imperatives of state sovereignty and international interventions. Our report successfully reconciled the tension with the innovative formula of the responsibility to protect, which was different from humanitarian intervention, not just linguistically, but substantively. Towards the end of the final commission meeting just outside Ottawa in August 2001, Cornelio Sonoruga, president of the ICRC for 13 years, commented, quote, and these are obviously from our own notes from that meeting, "If nothing else, we have killed off humanitarian intervention," unquote. The substantive differences between the two were also emphasized by Gareth and myself in our respective books, published in 2008 his and 2006 mine. ISIS Research Director Tom Weiss commented, quote, "ISIS sought to drive a stake through the heart of the term humanitarian intervention," unquote. Well, the pronouncement of the death of humanitarian intervention proved premature. And yet, as the author of the initial draft of the relevant sections of the original ISIS report, and as someone who has reflected, written and spoken on this topic extensively around the world over the last 15 years, I believe that the differences between humanitarian intervention and R2P are both real and consequential on political, conceptual, normative, procedural and operational dimensions. My follow-up paper would not have been necessary if the existing literature did not continue to be so widely ignored. Its neglect or lack of impact may well reflect the fact that the different stands of argument as to why we reject humanitarian intervention are scattered across the report and in subsequent writings and speeches by Gareth and me principally. Bringing them together in one coherent whole shows just how compelling the case for acknowledging the two as substantially different is. Politically, the visceral hostility of a large number of former colonized countries to humanitarian intervention is explained by the historical baggage of rapacious exploitation and cynical hypocrisy. Moreover, insistence on it suggests either deliberate duplicity or naivety on the part of ISIS commissions, all 12 ones, two Secretaries General, the UN community collectively, the large number of countries from the global south, intergovernmental humanitarian actors, and many NGOs who rejected humanitarian intervention but have accepted R2P. If the distinction drawn between the two is valid, then insistence on the language of humanitarian intervention betrays disrespect for all these groups, which explains my sharp reaction to the continued usage. And I hope all of you will read the book. When you read the chapters that are critical, including Siddhartha's, from this point of view, the essence of the criticism is that in reality R2P is the same old humanitarian intervention. So if you accept the difference, that criticism I think falls as well. Second, conceptually, while R2P defines the distribution of authority and jurisdiction between states on the one hand and the international community on the other, humanitarian intervention talks about the distribution of authority and jurisdiction between and among states only. This is the point made most forcefully and cogently by Anne Orford, so there's yet another Australian contribution to the debate. Third, normatively, humanitarian intervention rejects non-intervention and privileges the perspectives and rights of the intervening states. R2P redefines sovereignty as responsibility, which is our chapter, which is also sampled in the book, links it to the human protection norm, sidesteps and finesses without rejecting non-intervention, and addresses the issue from the point of view of the victims of atrocities. It's a fundamental difference. Procedurally, R2P can only be authorized by the UN, whereas humanitarian intervention is agnostic between UN and unilateral interventions. We didn't endorse coalitional dwelling in our report. What we said was, if the UN fails to discharge its responsibility, it must expect that some states will then form coalition dwelling. And that factor should be an additional reason for honoring its responsibility. I think the real world states will not fail to. And that, I think, is a statement of empirical fact which remains true. Operationally, protection of victims from mass atrocities requires distinctive guidelines and rules of engagement and different relationships to civil authorities and humanitarian actors, whereas humanitarian intervention operations are much closer to traditional wars and battles. This summarizes why I argue that R2P is not just terminologically, but substantially different. It was made necessary because of the visceral hostility to humanitarian intervention in most parts of the world, owing to its association with colonialism and neo-colonial interventions by Western powers. The differences, as I said, are manifested politically, conceptually, normatively, procedurally, and operationally. The continued usage of the old framework, in my mind, seeks to relitigate the debate that was lost and abandoned in the policy world in 2001 and 2005. And its major effect is to lengthen the distance between Western scholarship and the real world of international policy. R2P is an improvement in humanitarian intervention. On almost all dimensions, the international community finds objection. Consequently, military intervention under R2P has much better prospects of convergence between legality and legitimacy in the use of force compared to humanitarian intervention. But this doesn't mean that R2P resolves all the dilemmas of how outsiders can provide timely, decisive, and effective assistance to all groups in need of protection. R2P may be deep, but it remains so narrow that many areas beyond the four atrocity crimes, for example refugees, fall outside the scope. It remains subject to Security Council veto and paralysis. Certainly, no group at risk of atrocities can be confident of outside assistance in timely fashion. In the pre-R2P era, the two paradigmatic cases that highlighted the flaws of the then existing normative architecture were Rwanda in 1994, where there was international inaction to prevent the whole genocide, and Kosovo in 1999, where NATO intervened without UN authorization to bring an end to alleged Serbian atrocities. In the post-R2P era, the two paradigmatic cases to date that highlight its mobilizing power, but also underline the problems, might well comprise one, Libya in 2011, and you'll see that referred to continuously in the book, when NATO led a UN-authorized R2P intervention, but went beyond the civilian protection mandate of Resolution 1973 to effect regime change through what became in practice, I think, the humanitarian intervention operation. And second, Syria since 2011, where despite large numbers of civilian deaths and the confirmed use of chemical weapons, the United Nations has failed to take any robust and effective action. Other recent examples of ineffectual UN response to mass atrocities include South Sudan, Darfur, Central African Republic. To many countries and people, humanitarian intervention will remain attractive as an alternative moral framework for trying to respond effectively and in time, the promise of timely and decisive collective action, which is there in paragraph 138 and 139 of the original outcome document from 2005. But this can only be at the cost of immediate global controversy and long-term damage to the principle of an international order governed by the rule of law. Because of the inescapable problems of humanitarian intervention, and in the absence of reliable, predictable, and consistent provision of international protection to victims of atrocities within borders, the need remains like for an R2P plus protection normative architecture. At the start, I mentioned Cornelius Maruga from ICRC. Let me end, and I mentioned his intervention at the final commission. Let me end by recalling a folk tale told to us by Arsis co-chair Mohammed Sanoon at the first meeting of the Commission in Ottawa in November 2000. A man, he said, had grown up in a desert-like inland environment and never seen a fish in water. As he was walking along one day, he noticed a fish swimming in a pond. He thought, this poor animal has fallen into the water and cannot escape. It will drown if I don't rescue it. So he pulled it out of the water, put it in his pocket, and kept walking. A little later, he thought to check on how the fish was doing. Put his hand in his pocket, took it out, discovered it was dead. His conclusion: I didn't save it in time. Humanitarian intervention can be a lot like that, Sanoon cautioned us. Well-intentioned, but completely oblivious to the differences in context and capable of inflicting fatal harm. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ramesh. I'd just like to make a couple of comments in conclusion. First observation I make is that you read the book, one of the things that's actually striking is how many of the contributors are actually from Australia. And that's not because it was cheaper to contact people who were in Australia, but because Australia is actually very rich at the moment in its endowment with scholars who are thinking really seriously about these sorts of issues. So not just with us today, but people like Alex Bellamy and Tim Dunn and Sue Harris-Rimmer who have written chapters for the book as well. The second point I'd like to make is that there are display copies of the book in the corner, and if you're interested in obtaining a copy, you can record your name, and that will be the basis for Cambridge University Press then to supply you with a copy at their discount price. The third point I'd like to make, and this is something which I say specifically for the benefit of younger career researchers and PhD students who are with us today, we produced this book without 1 cent of grant money. This is the old way in which academics used to produce books, where instead of being under administrative pressure to raise money, which would then fuel academic activity, it's the curiosity and the interest of researchers in a particular area that allows the crystallisation of a community of scholars who can then contribute to volumes of this sort. So the lesson there is you don't have to get mega bucks out of a funding agency. That's an input measure rather than an output measure. And never discount the value, if you have an idea that's worth carrying forward, of simply contacting other like-minded scholars and see if they're interested in contributing to that kind of project as well. We were very fortunate in this project in the generosity that the various contributors showed in writing chapters for the book. They were not paid to do so, and we were not paid to be editors, and I, for one, see that as a reversion to maybe an old disappearing world, but one which I think deserves to be held up also as a model of what scholarship can involve. So I do hope that if you have a chance to read the book, you'll find it enjoyable. I think it's a very stimulating contributor to what is likely to be an ongoing debate. And the final point I'd make is norms do not spring fully formed from the brains of their begetters. The emergence of a norm is a bit like trying to get a diesel engine going. You may actually have to bleed off some oxygen bottles in the vicinity of the intake before it catches and starts running smoothly. And in that sense, or even an oxygen tank. And in that sense, we shouldn't be surprised that the period since the report of the International Commission came out in 2001 has witnessed fits and starts in the way in which different scholars and policymakers have approached the whole issue of responsibility to protect. That's what we should really contemplate in this kind of environment. And I think that in turn is reflected in the book itself, because as editors we made no attempt to impose any particular line of argument on the contributors. We simply asked them to address particular areas of interest to a wider readership in the chapters that they wrote. And as Hilary highlighted, you'll find very diverse kind of contributions with different orientations in the book, but I hope you'll find that that makes it an interesting volume to read as well. So thank you for joining us.